The blood pooled beneath her body, staining the white snow crimson as the blizzard howled through the canyon like a chorus of banshees. And Florence Barrett knew with absolute certainty that her husband had left her here to die. She pressed her trembling hand against the gash in her side where Marcus had driven the hunting knife. His face twisted with rage and whiskey-fueled madness just moments before he'd mounted his horse and ridden away without a backward glance. The wound burned like hellfire despite the freezing wind that cut through her torn dress, and she could feel the warmth of her own blood seeping between her fingers no matter how hard she pressed. The January storm of 1884 showed no mercy to the Wyoming wilderness, and Florence had maybe minutes before the cold or blood loss claimed her forever. She had trusted Marcus Barrett with everything. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of believing his promises that they would build something beautiful together in the frontier town of Jordan Valley, Oregon. Instead, he had gambled away every cent they owned, drunk himself into rages that grew more violent with each passing month, and finally accused her of infidelity with the merchant who had simply been kind enough to extend them credit at his general store. The accusation was baseless, born of Marcus's own guilt over his failings, but reason had abandoned him entirely when he dragged her from their wagon during their journey through Wyoming territory and attacked her with the blade. Florence's vision blurred as snowflakes caught in her eyelashes. She tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper, swallowed immediately by the screaming wind. Her fingers were going numb, and she could no longer tell if the shaking was from cold or shock. This was how it would end then. 23 years old and dying alone in a frozen wasteland because she had been foolish enough to believe in love. The sound of hoofbeats cut through her fading consciousness like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Jesus Christ. The voice was deep and urgent, followed immediately by the thud of boots hitting snow-packed ground. Strong hands touched her shoulders, then moved quickly to assess the wound at her side. "Madam, can you hear me? Stay with me now." Florence forced her eyes open and found herself staring up into a face weathered by sun and wind, with striking gray eyes that held both concern and determination. The man wore a heavy sheepskin coat and a wide-brimmed hat that was quickly accumulating snow, and his dark hair was long enough to brush his collar. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with the capable hands of someone who had spent his entire life working the land. "He left me," Florence managed to whisper through chattering teeth. "Stabbed me and left me." The man's jaw tightened, but he did not waste time with questions. Instead, he shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her before scooping her into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. "I have got you now. My camp is just over that ridge. We need to get you warm and stop this bleeding, you understand? You need to fight to stay awake." Florence tried to nod, but darkness was creeping in at the edges of her vision. She was vaguely aware of being lifted onto a horse, of the man mounting behind her and pulling her back against his chest as he urged the animal forward. His arm was like an iron band around her waist, careful to avoid her wound, and she could feel his heart beating steadily against her back. It was the first time in years she had felt safe in a man's embrace. "Almost there," he murmured near her ear, his breath warm against her frozen skin. "Stay with me. What is your name?" "Florence," she breathed. "Florence Barrett, Samuel Crawford, and you are not dying today, Florence Barrett. I give you my word." The camp materialized through the swirling snow like a miracle. A large canvas tent was pitched in a natural windbreak formed by towering pines and a rock outcropping, with a sturdy lean to shelter for the horses nearby. Samuel dismounted first, then lifted Florence down with the same careful strength. He kicked open the tent flap and carried her inside, where a small cast iron stove radiated blessed heat. He laid her on a bedroll and immediately began building up the fire, adding logs until the flames roared. Then he turned his full attention to Florence, producing a knife that made her flinch instinctively. "Easy now," Samuel said gently, his eyes meeting hers with surprising compassion. "I need to cut away the fabric so I can see how bad it is. I am not going to hurt you, I promise." Florence nodded shakily, watching as he carefully cut away the blood-soaked material of her dress and the layers beneath. His expression grew grim when he saw the wound, a vicious slash that ran from her lowest rib to her hip bone. The bleeding had slowed somewhat thanks to the cold, but it was still serious. "I have some medical training," Samuel explained as he retrieved a leather satchel from the corner of the tent. "Worked as a field medic during a cattle drive when their regular doc took sick. This is going to hurt something fierce, but I need to clean it and stitch it closed." He produced a bottle of whiskey and met her eyes again. "Drink as much as you can stand. It will help with the pain." Florence took the bottle with trembling hands and swallowed several burning mouthfuls. The alcohol hit her empty stomach like liquid fire, but warmth spread through her limbs almost immediately. Samuel waited until she had drunk enough to dull the worst of the pain before he began working. True to his word, it hurt worse than anything Florence had ever experienced. Samuel cleaned the wound with steady hands, his face set in lines of concentration as he worked. He murmured apologies whenever she whimpered, but his hands never faltered. When he began stitching the gash closed with surgical precision, Florence gripped the edge of the bedroll so hard her knuckles went white. "You are doing so well," Samuel said quietly, his voice an anchor in the storm of pain. "Just a few more. You are incredibly brave, Florence." No one had called her brave in years. Marcus had called her stupid, useless, worthless. Hearing this stranger speak with such genuine respect made tears stream down her face almost as much as the physical agony. Finally, Samuel tied off the last stitch and bandaged the wound with clean strips of cloth. He pulled a heavy wool blanket over her, tucking it carefully around her shoulders. "The worst is over. You need rest now and warmth and food when you can manage it." Florence watched through heavy-lidded eyes as Samuel moved around the tent with practiced efficiency. He heated snow in a pot on the stove until it melted into water, then added herbs that he explained would help prevent infection. He helped her drink the bitter tea, supporting her head with one hand while holding the cup to her lips with the other. His touch was gentle in a way that felt foreign after so long with Marcus. "Your husband did this?" Samuel asked finally, his voice carefully neutral. Florence nodded weakly. "Marcus. He has been drinking more and more, getting angrier. Today he accused me of something I would never do, and he just snapped. We were traveling from Oregon Territory, heading back east because he had burned every bridge in Jordan Valley with his gambling debts. But I think he decided somewhere along the way that he did not want a wife anymore. Maybe he thought if I died out here, he could collect on a life insurance policy or tell people it was an accident." Samuel's expression darkened. "A man who would do such a thing does not deserve the name." Where was he headed? East, I suppose, away from his failures. Florence closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her like a physical weight. "I should have left him years ago. I kept thinking he would change, that the man I married would come back. But that man never existed, I think. I just wanted so badly to believe in something." "Sleep now," Samuel said softly. "You are safe here. I will keep watch." Florence wanted to protest that she could not impose, that she should not trust another stranger after what her husband had done. But the combination of blood loss, shock, whiskey, and the first genuine kindness she had experienced in years overwhelmed her resistance. She drifted into unconsciousness listening to the howl of the wind outside and the crackle of the fire, feeling safer than she had in 3 long years. When Florence woke, pale winter sunlight was filtering through the tent canvas and the blizzard had passed. Her side throbbed with a deep, fierce ache, but the sharp agony had faded to something more manageable. Samuel sat near the stove, cooking something that smelled absolutely heavenly. He noticed her stirring and turned immediately, concern written across his features. "How are you feeling?" he asked, moving to kneel beside her bedroll. "Like I was stabbed and left to die in a blizzard," Florence attempted, her voice hoarse and weak. "But alive, which is more than I expected yesterday." The corner of Samuel's mouth lifted in the barest hint of a smile. "That is a fair assessment. Think you could manage some food? You need to rebuild your strength." He helped her sit up carefully, propping her against a saddle so she could eat without putting pressure on her stitches. The simple meal of beans and salt pork tasted like a feast, and Florence found herself eating with more appetite than she had possessed in months. Samuel watched with satisfaction, occasionally refilling her tin cup with hot coffee. "Thank you," Florence said when she had finished. "You saved my life. I do not know how I can ever repay such a debt." Samuel shook his head. "There is no debt. Any decent person would have done the same." "Marcus would not have," Florence said quietly. "Most men I have known would not have. You are different, Samuel Crawford." He looked uncomfortable with the praise, focusing instead on cleaning up the breakfast things. "I was raised by a good woman who taught me that strength means nothing if it is not used to protect those who need protecting. My mother survived her own hardships out here on the frontier. She would have been furious if I had ridden past someone in need." "Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman. Is she in Wyoming?" "She passed 4 years ago," Samuel said, and Florence heard the thread of old grief in his voice. "Influenza outbreak. My father had died when I was young, so it was just the 2 of us for most of my life. After she was gone, I took to wandering. I work ranches, drive cattle, pick up jobs wherever I can find them. No ties, no obligations. Seemed easier that way." Florence understood loneliness when she heard it. Samuel had saved her life, but she recognized a kindred soul. Someone who had been hurt by loss and had chosen solitude as protection against further pain. "What were you doing out in that blizzard?" she asked. "Heading toward a ranch about 20 miles north of here. They need extra hands for the spring season, and I figured I would arrive a few months early to help with winter work. The storm came up faster than expected, so I made camp to wait it out." His gray eyes met hers steadily. "I am grateful I did, or I never would have found you." They fell into a companionable silence, broken only by the pop and hiss of the fire. Florence found herself studying Samuel when he was not looking. There was something solid about him, something trustworthy that had nothing to do with his physical strength, and everything to do with the quiet integrity she sensed beneath his reserved exterior. He had saved her without question, tended her wounds with competence and compassion, and asked nothing in return. It was so different from Marcus's constant demands and criticisms that Florence felt off balance, unsure how to navigate simple human decency after so long without it. Over the following days, Florence slowly regained her strength under Samuel's careful attention. He changed her bandages twice daily, his hands always gentle despite their calluses. He cooked meals that were simple but nourishing, and he helped her move around the tent when she grew restless from lying still. When fever set in on the 3rd day, as he had warned her it might, Samuel stayed awake through the night applying cool cloths to her forehead and making sure she drank enough water. In her delirium, Florence called out for her mother, who had died when Florence was just 16. She relived moments from her marriage to Marcus, crying out denials to his accusations and pleading with him not to hurt her. Through it all, Samuel's steady voice anchored her, reminding her that she was safe, that Marcus could not reach her, that she was going to survive this. When the fever finally broke on the fourth morning, Florence woke to find Samuel asleep in a chair near her bedroll, his head tipped back against the tent pole, and exhaustion written in every line of his body. She watched him sleep and felt something shift in her chest, some ice-bound piece of her heart beginning to thaw. This man owed her nothing, yet he had given her everything. "You are awake," Samuel said, his eyes opening as though he had sensed her regard. "The fever broke. How do you feel?" "Weak, but better. You should rest properly, Samuel. You have been taking care of me for days. You must be exhausted." "I will rest when I am certain you are out of danger," he replied, but she could hear the weariness in his voice. "I am out of danger because of you," Florence said firmly. "Please take the bedroll, I insist. I can sit in the chair for a while." Samuel looked like he wanted to argue, but another jaw-cracking yawn betrayed him. Finally, he nodded. "A few hours, then. But you wake me if you need anything, understood?" "Understood." Florence settled into the chair, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and watched as Samuel stretched out on the bedroll. He was asleep within minutes, his breathing deep and even. She found herself studying the planes of his face, the strong jaw softened slightly by sleep, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. He was handsome, she realized, though it was a rugged, honest handsomeness that had nothing to do with Marcus's superficial charm. Marcus had been beautiful in a flashy way, with golden hair and blue eyes and a smile that could convince anyone of anything. He had swept Florence off her feet with grand gestures and pretty words, and she had been too young and naive to see the selfishness beneath the surface. Samuel was Marcus's opposite in every conceivable way. He spoke little but meant every word. His gestures were small but genuine. He promised nothing except what he could deliver, and he delivered far more than he promised. The realization that she was developing feelings for her rescuer should have frightened Florence. Instead, it felt like the first truly right thing she had experienced in years. She did not expect Samuel to return such feelings. He had shown her compassion because that was who he was, not because he wanted anything from her. But Florence could acknowledge to herself that something was blooming in her heart, fragile and new as a spring flower pushing through snow. When Samuel woke several hours later, he found Florence attempting to stand on her own. He was across the tent in 3 strides, his hands steadying her before she could fall. "Easy," he cautioned. "You are not ready for that yet." "I need to be able to move," Florence protested, frustrated by her own weakness. "I cannot lie around forever. You have your own life to get back to, Samuel. I am sure the ranch is expecting you." "The ranch can wait. You are not recovered enough to travel, and I am not leaving you alone out here. You have done so much already. I cannot ask you to put your life on hold for me." Samuel's hands were still on her arms, steadying her, and his eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You are not asking. I am choosing. Do you understand the difference, Florence? I choose to stay until you are well." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was quite ready to name. Florence felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with fever, and Samuel seemed to realize how close they were standing. He released her carefully and stepped back, but something had shifted between them in that moment. Over the next week, Florence grew stronger day by day. She could walk around the tent without assistance, and the wound in her side was healing cleanly thanks to Samuel's diligent care. The weather had cleared, revealing a winter landscape of stunning beauty. Samuel helped her outside for short periods, letting her breathe fresh air and feel sunlight on her face while he kept a careful eye on her, in case she tired. They talked during those long winter days, sharing stories of their lives with increasing openness. Florence told him about growing up in Ohio, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. She described her parents' loving marriage and how devastated she had been when her mother died of consumption. Her father had followed less than a year later, his heart simply giving out from grief, and Florence had been left alone at 17 with no family and few prospects. Marcus seemed like salvation, she admitted one afternoon as they sat outside the tent in a patch of weak sunlight. He promised me security, a home, a future. I was so desperate to have a family again that I did not see the warning signs. The way he drank too much even during our courtship. How he charmed people but never formed real friendships. The little lies that I told myself did not matter. By the time I realized my mistake, we were married, and I felt trapped. "You are not trapped anymore," Samuel said quietly. Florence looked at him, this man who had become her whole world in the space of less than 2 weeks. "No, I suppose I am not. Thanks to you, I have a second chance at life. I am not going to waste it." Samuel shared his own history slowly, parceling out pieces like precious treasures. He had been born in Texas, the son of a ranch hand and a Mexican woman whose family had disowned her for marrying outside their culture. His father had been killed in a stampede when Samuel was only 8, leaving his mother to raise him alone while working as a laundress and cook. She had been fierce and loving in equal measure, teaching him to read and write, to treat everyone with respect regardless of their station, and to never mistake cruelty for strength. She used to say that any fool can hurt someone weaker than themselves, Samuel told Florence. Real strength is knowing when to be gentle, when to protect instead of dominate. I think about that a lot, especially when I meet men like your husband. Former husband, Florence corrected. I do not care if the law still considers us married. Marcus lost any claim to me when he left me to die. If I ever see him again, it will be to ensure he faces justice for what he did. Something fierce and protective flashed in Samuel's eyes. If you ever see him again, he will have to go through me first. The promise sent a shiver through Florence that was not entirely due to the cold. She had spent 3 years with a man who had promised to protect her, but had instead become her greatest threat. Now here was Samuel, who promised nothing but whose every action demonstrated the kind of man he was. A man who kept watch through fevered nights, who changed bandages with gentle hands, who cooked meals and told stories and treated her like she mattered. Florence was falling in love with him. The realization settled over her with quiet certainty, and she knew she needed to be careful. Samuel had saved her out of basic human decency, not because he wanted romantic entanglement. She could not burden him with feelings he might not return, especially when she was still legally married to another man and carried the fresh wounds of betrayal. But knowing she should guard her heart and actually accomplishing, it proved to be 2 different things entirely. It happened in small moments. The way Samuel's whole face transformed when he smiled, rare as such expressions were. The sound of his laughter when she made an unexpectedly sharp observation about the behavior of the horses. The comfortable silences they could share while he repaired tack, and she attempted to sew up the tears in her dress. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention, his gray eyes soft with something that might have been tenderness. 2 weeks after Samuel had found her, Florence was well enough to ride short distances. Samuel announced that they should head toward the nearest town, a small settlement called Riverdale about 15 miles south. Florence would need proper clothes, and they both needed supplies. He did not say it, but Florence understood that he was also considering her future. She could not live in his tent forever, and she would need to find work and lodging somewhere. The thought of separating from Samuel created a hollow ache in her chest, but Florence tried to be practical. She had already imposed on his generosity for too long. They broke camp on a cold but clear morning in early February. Samuel packed his belongings with practiced efficiency while Florence helped as much as she was able. He lifted her onto his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Flint, then mounted behind her. Florence tried not to think about how right it felt to ride within the circle of his arms, her back pressed against his chest and his warmth surrounding her. The journey to Riverdale took most of the day, with frequent stops to rest and ensure Florence was not overexerting herself. They talked little during the ride, but the silence felt companionable rather than awkward. Florence watched the winter landscape roll past and tried to imagine what came next. She had no money, no possessions beyond the ruined dress she wore and Samuel's borrowed coat. She would need to find work, but what could she do? She had some education and could read and write well, but most frontier towns had little use for such skills. Perhaps she could find work as a laundress or cook, though the thought of returning to the drudgery of her marriage made her stomach clench. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel asked, his voice rumbling through his chest into her back. "The future. What I am going to do. I have nothing, Samuel. No money, no belongings, no prospects. I do not even know if I can legally separate from Marcus, or if I will forever be tied to a man who tried to murder me." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "The law is complicated out here on the frontier. Marriages can be dissolved if you can prove abandonment or abuse, though it takes time. As for work and lodging, we will figure something out. You are not without resources, Florence. You are intelligent, capable, and stronger than you realize. I feel anything but strong. You survived what would have killed most people. You fought through fever and pain without complaint. You are learning to trust again after someone you loved betrayed you in the worst possible way. That is strength, Florence. Do not sell yourself short." His words wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket, and Florence blinked back tears. She had not realized how much she needed to hear that she was more than Marcus's accusations and cruelty had made her believe. Riverdale proved to be a rough but bustling settlement of perhaps 200 souls. The main street boasted a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a small church, and a boarding house that looked only slightly less weathered than the other buildings. Samuel guided Flint to the hitching post outside the general store and dismounted before helping Florence down with careful hands. "Let me do the talking at first," he said quietly. "Small towns can be suspicious of strangers, especially women traveling alone. Better if they think you are with me." Florence nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words even as they sent a small thrill through her. Pretending to be with Samuel, even temporarily, felt like a glimpse of a life she desperately wanted but had no right to claim. The interior of the general store was warm and cluttered, every available surface covered with goods ranging from canned foods to farming equipment. A thin man with spectacles and thinning hair stood behind the counter, looking up from his ledger as they entered. "Help you folks?" he asked, his eyes moving from Samuel to Florence with barely concealed curiosity. "We need supplies," Samuel said, his tone polite but not overly friendly. "Trail rations, medical supplies, and some clothes for the lady. Her trunk was lost in the blizzard last week." The shopkeeper's expression softened slightly. "That was a bad storm. Lot of folks got caught out in it. You are fortunate to have made it through. Name is Harold Jennings. I run this establishment. Samuel Crawford, this is Florence. We appreciate any help you can offer." Harold nodded and began pulling bolts of fabric and ready-made garments from various shelves. Florence selected the most practical items: a wool dress, warm undergarments, a heavy cloak, sturdy boots. Everything was simple and serviceable, designed for frontier life rather than fashion. Samuel paid without hesitation despite Florence's protests, insisting that she could repay him once she was settled. While Harold wrapped their purchases, he provided valuable information about the town. The boarding house had rooms available, run by a widow named Mrs. Peterson, who was known to be fair. The church was led by Pastor Williams, who occasionally helped newcomers find work. There was even a small schoolhouse, though the teacher had recently left to get married. You would not happen to know your letters, would you, miss? Harold asked Florence with sudden interest. The town has been desperate to find someone to teach the children. Does not pay much, but it comes with a small cabin adjacent to the schoolhouse and enough to live on. Florence's heart leaped. I can read and write. My father was a schoolteacher. He educated me thoroughly. Well then, you should speak with Pastor Williams and the town council. They have been interviewing candidates, but most folks who can teach do not want to settle in a place as small as Riverdale. If you are interested, you might have found yourself employment. Samuel's hand found the small of Florence's back, a gesture of support that made her feel less alone. That sounds like an excellent opportunity. Where would we find Pastor Williams? The pastor proved to be a kindly man in his 50s with a shock of white hair and a warm smile. He listened to Florence's story, edited to remove the most disturbing details, but honest about her situation as an abandoned wife seeking to start over. Samuel's presence beside her seemed to lend credibility to her character, and Pastor Williams asked her to read from the Bible and perform some simple arithmetic to demonstrate her skills. You are more than qualified, the pastor said when she had finished. The position is yours if you want it, Miss Barrett. The cabin is small but sturdy, and we can have it ready for you within a few days. The children are eager to resume their studies. Florence felt tears prick her eyes. I want it. Thank you, Pastor Williams. You have no idea what this means to me. Everyone deserves a second chance, the pastor replied gently. Welcome to Riverdale. Samuel helped Florence move into the cabin 3 days later, carrying her few belongings and checking every inch of the small structure to ensure it was sound. The cabin consisted of a single room with a pot-bellied stove, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves for supplies. It was simple to the point of austerity, but to Florence, it represented something precious: independence and safety. It is perfect, she said, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. Samuel set down the last box and met her eyes. You are sure you will be all right here on your own? I could stay in town for a while, make sure you are settled. Florence wanted to say yes. She wanted to beg him to stay, to not leave her when she had only just found him, but she could see the restlessness in the way he stood, the subtle tension in his shoulders. Samuel was a wanderer by nature, and she had no right to cage him. I will be fine, she forced herself to say. You have already done so much for me, Samuel, more than I could ever repay. You should go to that ranch job. They must be wondering what happened to you. Something flickered in Samuel's expression, there and gone too quickly for Florence to identify. If you need anything, send word. The ranch is called the Double Creek, about 20 miles north. I will come if you call. I know you will. They stood there in the small cabin, neither quite willing to take the final step toward goodbye. Florence memorized everything about this moment. The way afternoon light slanted through the single window, the smell of wood smoke from the stove, the exact shade of gray in Samuel's eyes. Florence, Samuel said, his voice rough with something that might have been regret. I want you to know that these past weeks, taking care of you, they have been some of the best of my life. You made me remember that there is more to living than just surviving. I will not forget that. I will not forget you. Florence's throat tightened with emotion. I could never forget you, Samuel Crawford. You saved my life in every way a person can be saved. Whatever happens from here, wherever life takes us, you will always have my gratitude and my friendship." The word friendship felt inadequate, but Florence could not bring herself to say more. Not when Samuel was about to walk out of her life, possibly forever. Samuel stepped forward and pulled her into a careful embrace, mindful of her still healing wound. Florence pressed her face against his chest and breathed in the scent of him, leather and wood smoke, and something uniquely his own. His arms tightened around her for just a moment, and then he was stepping back, putting necessary distance between them. "Goodbye, Florence. Be well." "Goodbye, Samuel. Thank you for everything." He left quickly after that, as though staying a moment longer would make departure impossible. Florence stood in the doorway and watched him ride away on Flint, heading north toward the Double Creek Ranch and away from her. She did not cry until he had disappeared from view, and then the tears came in a flood. Florence threw herself into her new role as schoolteacher with desperate energy, trying to fill the aching void Samuel's absence had left. The children of Riverdale ranged in age from 6 to 14, and they were eager for education despite their rough frontier upbringing. Florence taught reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography, and she found genuine joy in watching her students' progress. In the evenings, she read by lamplight and tried not to think about gray eyes and gentle hands. Spring arrived gradually, melting the snow and turning the world green. Florence's wound healed to a thin scar, a permanent reminder of how close she had come to death and how much her life had changed. The people of Riverdale accepted her into their community, and she made friends among the other women in town. Mrs. Peterson from the boarding house brought her fresh bread every Sunday. Harold Jennings extended her credit at the general store. Pastor Williams checked on her regularly and never pressed about the details of her past that she chose not to share. It was a good life, Florence told herself. Safe, stable, purposeful. Everything she had dreamed of during those dark days with Marcus, so why did she feel like half of herself was missing? 2 months after Samuel had left, Florence was walking home from the schoolhouse on a warm April evening when she spotted a familiar bay gelding tied outside the general store. Her heart started pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She picked up her skirts and walked faster, hope and fear warring in her chest. Samuel emerged from the store just as she reached the hitching post. He looked thinner than she remembered, and there was a tension in him that had not been there before. When he saw her, he went completely still, his eyes drinking her in like a man dying of thirst who had finally found water. "Florence," he breathed. "Samuel, what are you doing here?" She could not keep the tremor from her voice or the hope from her eyes. "I came to see you. I needed to know that you were all right, that you were happy." He took a step closer, his gaze searching her face. "Are you happy?" Florence tried to lie to tell him that she was perfectly content with her new life, but the words would not come. "I am grateful for everything I have here. The teaching position is wonderful and the town has been welcoming. I am safer and more stable than I have been in years." "That is not what I asked." The intensity in his voice made Florence's breath catch. "No, Samuel, I am not happy. I have been miserable since the day you left. I tell myself I should be satisfied, that I have more than I deserve, but nothing feels right without you." Samuel closed the remaining distance between them in 2 long strides. His hands came up to frame her face, and his eyes blazed with an emotion Florence hardly dared name. "I tried to stay away. I told myself you needed time to heal, to build a life independent of any man. I took the job at the Double Creek and worked myself to exhaustion trying not to think about you. But every day I woke up and you were the first thing on my mind. Every night I fell asleep remembering the sound of your voice. I have been halfway in love with you since the moment I found you bleeding in the snow, and I am done pretending otherwise." Florence's heart felt like it might burst from her chest. "You love me." "I love you, Florence Barrett. I love your strength and your courage. I love how you read to the children with such passion that they forget to fidget. I love the way you laugh when something surprises you, and how you face difficulties without complaining. I love everything about you, and if you feel even a fraction of the same, I am begging you to tell me, because I cannot go another day without knowing if there is a chance for us." "Yes," Florence whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Samuel, I love you. I have loved you for weeks, but I was too afraid to say anything. Too afraid that you saved me out of obligation, not because you wanted me. Too afraid that I was just another person you would leave behind." "I am not going anywhere," Samuel said fiercely. "I am staying right here in Riverdale if you will have me. I will find work nearby, build us a proper house, court you properly the way you deserve. And when enough time has passed, and you can legally end your marriage to that bastard who hurt you, I am going to marry you, Florence. If you will have me." "Yes," Florence said again, and then Samuel was kissing her, his lips warm and gentle against hers. It was nothing like kissing Marcus had been. There was no demand in it, no attempt to dominate or control. Instead, Samuel kissed her like she was precious, like she was the answer to every prayer he had never known to speak. Florence's arms went around his neck and she kissed him back, pouring 3 years of loneliness and pain and desperate hope into the connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I am never leaving you again. You understand? Wherever you go, whatever you need, I am there. Always." "Always," Florence echoed and felt the last broken pieces of her heart begin to mend. True to his word, Samuel found work at a ranch just outside Riverdale. He rented a room at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house and began courting Florence with old-fashioned propriety that made the townspeople nod in approval. He walked her home from the schoolhouse every evening, sitting on her front step to talk until the stars came out. He attended church services beside her every Sunday and took meals with her at the boarding house under Mrs. Peterson's watchful eye. He brought her wildflowers and books, and once, memorably, a kitten that one of the ranch cats had produced. The cat, which Florence named Scout for his adventurous nature, became a fixture in the schoolhouse. The children adored him, and even the most reluctant students would complete their lessons for the privilege of holding him during recess. As spring turned to summer, Florence worked with Pastor Williams and a lawyer from the county seat to formally dissolve her marriage to Marcus. The process was complicated by Marcus's absence, but witnesses who had known him in Jordan Valley provided testimony about his drinking, gambling, and violent behavior. The knife wound, which Florence documented with the help of the town doctor, provided physical evidence of attempted murder. By late August, the legal dissolution was complete. Florence was no longer Florence Barrett, wife of Marcus Barrett. She was simply Florence, free woman and schoolteacher of Riverdale. Samuel proposed the same day the paperwork was finalized. He took Florence for a walk along the river that gave the town its name, holding her hand as they followed the winding bank upstream. When they reached a particularly beautiful spot where willows trailed their branches in the clear water, Samuel dropped to one knee. "Florence, I do not have much to offer you in terms of material wealth," he said, looking up at her with his heart in his eyes. "But I can promise you loyalty, partnership, and love for all the days of my life. I can promise that I will protect you, support your dreams, and stand beside you through whatever challenges we face. I can promise that I will never raise my hand or my voice to you in anger, and that I will spend every day trying to deserve the gift of your love." Will you marry me and let me spend my life proving these promises?" Florence pulled him to his feet and kissed him soundly before answering. "Yes, Samuel Crawford. Yes to all of it, now and always." They were married in the small church in September, with the entire town in attendance. Florence wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Peterson and the other town women had sewn for her, and Samuel wore his best shirt and a new vest. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony, his voice warm with blessing as he pronounced them husband and wife. When Samuel kissed his bride, the children from Florence's class cheered so loudly that several people laughed. The town threw them a celebration at the community hall, with music and dancing and more food than Florence had seen in one place since childhood. Samuel danced with her until her feet ached, holding her close and whispering how much he loved her between songs. When they finally left to spend their wedding night in the cabin that would soon be too small for their growing dreams, Florence felt a peace she had never known was possible. Samuel carried her over the threshold, despite her laughing protests that her injury was long healed. He set her down gently in the lamplight and began removing the pins from her hair with careful fingers, letting the dark waves fall around her shoulders. "You are so beautiful," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion and desire. "I cannot believe I get to call you my wife." "I cannot believe I get to call you my husband," Florence replied, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "Thank you for finding me in that blizzard, Samuel. Thank you for saving my life and then showing me what life could be." "Thank you for letting me love you," Samuel said, and then there were no more words, only the sweet discovery of two people who had found home in each other's arms. The years that followed were not without challenges. Samuel and Florence saved every penny to buy their own small ranch, working side by side to build something lasting. Florence continued teaching, beloved by generations of students, while Samuel built a reputation as one of the most reliable ranch hands in the county. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, occasional illness, and the everyday struggles of frontier life. But through it all, they had each other. Their first child, a son they named Thomas, arrived 2 years after their wedding. He had Samuel's gray eyes and Florence's dark hair, and both parents fell completely in love with him from the moment he drew breath. Their second child, a daughter named Caroline, came 3 years later. She was fierce and independent from birth, and Samuel joked that she had inherited Florence's strength without any of the restraint. As Thomas and Caroline grew, Florence told them stories about how she and their father had met. She edited the details for young ears, focusing on the blizzard and Samuel's rescue rather than the violence that had preceded it. But she made sure her children understood that real love looked like their father's actions, putting someone else's needs first, offering comfort without expectation, choosing to stay even when leaving would have been easier. Marcus Barrett was never seen or heard from again. Florence occasionally wondered what had become of him, whether he had drunk himself to death in some nameless town or built a new life on lies elsewhere. But she found that, as the years passed, she thought of him less and less. He had been a painful chapter in her story, but Samuel had given her the pen to write new chapters filled with love and purpose. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Samuel gave Florence a leather-bound journal. "For your thoughts," he said simply. "You have always been good with words, and I thought you might want to record our story. For the children, and their children after them." Florence opened the journal that night after the children were asleep, Samuel reading beside her in the lamplight. She thought about everything they had survived and built together. The blizzard that had nearly killed her but instead had led her to the love of her life, the slow healing of body and heart, the marriage that had exceeded every dream she had held as a young girl, the children who filled their home with noise and laughter, the ranch they had built with their own hands. She picked up her pen and wrote the first line. The blood pooled beneath her body, staining the white snow crimson as the blizzard howled through the canyon, and Florence Barrett knew with absolute certainty that her husband had left her here to die. Samuel glanced over and read the words, his expression darkening at the memory. Then he read the next line she added, "But she lived." And in living, she found everything she had ever wanted and more than she knew to dream of. "That is a better ending than the beginning suggested," Samuel said softly. "It is not an ending," Florence replied, setting down her pen to take her husband's hand. "It is just the part I have lived so far. The best parts are still being written." Samuel raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, his eyes warm with the love that had sustained them through a decade of marriage and would continue for all the decades to come. "Then I cannot wait to see what happens next, Mrs. Crawford." Outside their small ranch house, Wyoming stretched out under a canopy of stars, vast and beautiful and full of possibility. The wind that had once howled with killing cold now whispered warm promises through the grass. And inside, safe in the circle of lamplight and love, Florence and Samuel looked toward their future together. Scout the cat jumped onto Florence's lap, purring loudly, and from the children's bedroom came the sound of Thomas reading quietly to Caroline from the storybook Florence had given them. Everything was peaceful. Everything was right. Everything was exactly as it should be. Florence had been saved from death in a blizzard, but Samuel had saved her from something far worse. A life without love, without hope, without knowing her own worth. And in return, she had saved him from loneliness and wandering, giving him the home and family he had never admitted he longed for. They had found each other in the worst possible moment and built the best possible life. That was the true miracle, Florence thought. Not that Samuel had appeared when she needed rescuing, but that they had recognized in each other something worth fighting for, worth building toward, worth cherishing through all the years to come. "I love you," she said to Samuel, as she did every night before they slept. "I love you more," he replied, as he always did, and Florence smiled because she knew they would happily argue this point for the rest of their lives. Thomas eventually took over running the ranch with his father's guidance, while Caroline surprised everyone by becoming a teacher like her mother. Both children married for love rather than convenience, having been raised to understand the difference. As grandchildren arrived, Florence and Samuel's house rang with the sound of young voices, and the couple who had found each other in a Wyoming blizzard watched their legacy grow and flourish. When they were old and gray, sitting on the porch of the ranch house Samuel had built with his own hands, Florence sometimes thought back to that terrible moment when Marcus had left her bleeding in the snow. She no longer felt anger or pain when she remembered it. Instead, she felt a strange sort of gratitude, because without that darkness, she would never have found her light. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel asked, his weathered hand finding hers with the ease of 50 years of practice. "About how the worst moment of my life led directly to all the best moments," Florence replied. "About how you found me when I needed finding. About how grateful I am for every single day we have had together." Samuel squeezed her hand gently. "I am the one who is grateful. You gave me everything, Florence. Purpose, family, a reason to stop running and start building. You gave me a home when I did not even know I was lost. We found each other," Florence said simply, "and that made all the difference." As the sun set over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Florence and Samuel sat together in contented silence. They had weathered blizzards both literal and metaphorical. They had survived wounds that should have killed them, both of body and spirit. They had built something lasting from the wreckage of their separate pasts, proving that even the worst beginnings could lead to the most beautiful endings. Their story had begun with blood and snow and the howl of killing wind. But it had transformed into warmth and light and the steady beat of two hearts that had learned to beat as one. It was a love story forged in the Wild West, tempered by hardship and proven true through decades of devotion. And when their grandchildren asked them to tell the story one more time, of how Grandpa Samuel had found Grandma Florence in the blizzard, they would smile at each other with the secret knowledge that the finding had been mutual. Two lost souls discovering home in each other's arms, proving that salvation sometimes came not with fanfare but with gentle hands and a steady voice saying, "I have got you now. You are safe." That promise, made in a moment of desperation, had held true for a lifetime. And as Florence and Samuel rocked together on their porch, hands intertwined and hearts at peace, they knew it would hold true beyond this life and into whatever came next. Some bonds, once forged, could never be broken. Some loves, once found, lasted forever. Theirs was that kind of love. The kind worth surviving for. The kind worth building a life around. The kind that transformed tragedy into triumph and turned two wounded souls into one unbreakable whole. The Wyoming wind whispered through the grass, no longer a harbinger of death but a witness to life and love, and the enduring power of two people who refused to give up on each other or themselves. And in that wind, if you listened carefully, you could hear the echo of a promise kept, and a love that would outlast the mountains themselves. Samuel and Florence Crawford lived to see their grandchildren grown and their great-grandchildren born. They celebrated 60 years of marriage surrounded by the family they had built and the community they had served. When Samuel passed quietly in his sleep at the age of 88, Florence held his hand and whispered her love one final time, grateful beyond measure for every moment they had shared. She followed him 6 months later, on a snowy winter day that reminded her of how they had begun. Her last thought was not of pain or fear, but of Samuel's face the first time he had told her he loved her, and the knowledge that soon she would see him again. The people of Riverdale mourned them as they had lived, together. They were buried side by side in the cemetery overlooking the valley, their headstones simply engraved with their names, their years, and a single line. They found each other in the snow and built a love that lasted forever. And that, in the end, was the truest thing anyone could say about Florence and Samuel Crawford. They had found each other when both were lost, saved each other when both needed saving, and loved each other with the kind of devotion that turned an ordinary life into an extraordinary one. Their story became legend in Riverdale and the surrounding territory, told and retold to each new generation as proof that love could triumph over even the darkest circumstances. That redemption was possible. That choosing compassion over cruelty, love over loneliness, hope over despair, could change everything. And sometimes, on winter nights when the wind howled through Wyoming just as it had that long ago February day, people swore they could see two figures riding together through the snow. A cowboy and his lady, heading home at last, forever inseparable, forever at peace, forever proof that true love, once found, never truly ends.